In this video, we're going to look at how energy moves through ecosystems. So all organisms need energy, they need materials, and they need space in order to do all the things that they need to do. They get these, it's called their niche. So their niche is how they get what they need. And another way to think of this is how they interact with their environment. So for example, that's where you fit into the food chain. So what do you eat? What eats you? All of those kind of things go into your niche. Now, all the energy in an ecosystem originally comes from the sun. And then that energy can be transferred from organism to organism through a food chain. Autotrophs are organisms that are able to make food through photosynthesis. So they are the ones that actually capture that solar energy and allow it to flow through an ecosystem. So without them, there is no energy really available. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, are things that have to eat food. So they can't make their own, they have to eat other things. And when we look at these words, auto means self, troph means feeding. So they are organisms that feed themselves through photosynthesis. Hetero means different, so they have to feed themselves off of different organisms. So there's a number of types of heterotrophs. So we have herbivores that only eat autotrophs like plants, so something like a deer. Carnivores that eat other heterotrophs, so they eat meat. That would be something like a wolf. Omnivores eat both, so they eat plants and animals, so that's something like a bear. And decomposers that break down dead stuff and recycle it back into the ecosystem, so things like fungi, bacteria, vultures, those kinds of things. So as an organism gets energy, that energy is going to be used for a lot of different things. So for example, organisms need to grow and they need to maintain their bodies. So that takes a lot of energy to do. Having the organism just function also takes a lot of energy. All of the reactions in your body, having to move, all of those things take lots of energy. And then some of it's just lost as heat. So organisms are radiating heat, especially if you are a warm-blooded animal. And the bottom line here is that most of the energy that an organism takes in ends up being used by that organism or lost as heat. And this means that if something eats you, it doesn't have the ability to get all of that energy that you got. So energy is transferred when one organism eats another. So when you eat a plant or when you eat an animal that ate a plant, that energy is being transferred down the chain. The problem here is that very little is actually transferred. So remember, because an organism uses most of the energy that it takes in, if you were to eat that organism, you only get about 10% of the energy that that organism originally got. So each time you transfer energy, only about 10% of it actually gets transferred. And this is called the 10% rule. So the overall way this works, so 100% of the energy that enters an ecosystem comes from the sun, and autotrophs are going to be the ones that capture that. So they have access to all that energy. However, they're going to use about 90% of that energy to incorporate it into their bodies, or it ends up being wasted as heat. That means that those herbivores only have about 10% of the energy that originally came from the sun available to them. They also use about 90% of that. So then your carnivores and omnivores only have about 10% of that. So each time you go up, you're losing about 90% of the energy. So here we have an example of a food chain, and each step in this food chain is going to be called a trophic level, so a feeding level. And you can think of that as a transfer of energy. So we have primary producers, which are taking energy from the sun, and then the primary consumers are eating those things, and therefore there's a transfer of energy between levels. So each one of these steps in a food chain is a trophic level. Now, as you go up the trophic level, as we've talked about, the energy is being used by each organism at each energy level. So the plankton have all the energy because they get it from the sun. When the krill eat the plankton, they only get about 10% of that energy that originally came from the sun. Then the salmon only get about 10% of that, so that's 1% overall. And then each time it's going down by 90%. So what you end up having happen is that there is much, much less energy as you go up a food chain. And because there's less energy, you can't support as many individuals. So there's going to be a lot more plankton than krill, a lot more krill than salmon, and so on. And in this case, there's going to be fewer sharks than anyone because there's less energy available to them. And this sets up what we call a trophic pyramid. So this is a graphical representation of the number of individuals in each level of this food chain. And this is based on the energy available. So you can see that the primary producers have the largest population, and then as we go up the food chain, you get fewer and fewer individuals because there's less and less energy available.